One of the most memorable moments of his leadership, certainly one I shall never forget, was his groundbreaking parliamentary initiative to recognise and apologise on behalf of the nation to the stolen generations in 2008. He remains deeply engaged on the question of Australia's strategic and economic future in Asia, Aboriginal reconciliation, homelessness and organ donation. It's with great privilege I introduce to you the Honourable Kevin Rudd to officially launch Power and Colour.
Thank you very much. And I begin by acknowledging the first Australians on whose land we meet and whose cultures we celebrate as the oldest continuing cultures in human history. Whenever I say that, and I say it a lot around the nation, it still brings a slight tingle to the spine, because those of us who are privileged to share this vast continent with the first Australians are indeed blessed with an experience which is unique in the world. And that is, here we share this continent with a culture which has been here since time immemorial, with an extraordinary wisdom, an extraordinary learning, an extraordinary experience of nature and of life, of colour and of power, for tens and tens of thousands of years. I sometimes think that we in Australia need to pinch ourselves from time to time to be reminded of that reality. If you are anywhere else in the world and you talk about your fellow Europeans as having been in this country for 70,000 years or more, it would simply not be possible. It would be beyond their comprehension. It is, however, our unique and our privileged experience. And of course I acknowledge Pat and all those who sail with him. And it is a mighty ship indeed, Pat Corrigan. George Brandis, who's here, and I think I saw Jane Prentice before as well, other colleagues and friends, one and all. And our good friends here at Goma, this marvellous, I think quite extraordinary gallery by any standard anywhere in the world. When Therese launched this book, New Beginnings, the first volume about Pat's collection some 5 years ago, we were then embracing the spirit of the apology. This was indeed a good time in what has been the troubled history of reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. And in Therese's absence, I'm pleased and delighted to have been offered second spot in launching the reserve place in launching Volume 2. And she sends you, Pat, her best wishes today. 5 years on from the apology, I'm pleased to report that the spirit of reconciliation is still alive and well in Australia. We all know the problems are immense, but I think it's fair to report that the progress also has been real. And one of the dynamics of progress has been the extraordinary awakening across our country and across the world of the beauty and the wonder and the spirituality, the depth and the breadth and the colour and the evocative qualities of what we now call the contemporary or modern Indigenous Aboriginal art movement of Australia. In preparing for this morning, I had a look at Therese's speech, which in turn turned me back to the volume which she launched back then. It's a pretty interesting volume itself before we turn to the current one. It has a few things to say, which I think are worthy of reflection today as well. One of the things said in the preface to the first volume was this, and it really caused me to think and to think again. It said, maybe that the legacy of colonialism, so infused in the Australian psyche and characterised by what is done to and for Aboriginal people, rather than by what Aboriginal people do for Australia, can now be transformed. Let me say that one more time. a colonial psyche characterised by what is done to and for Aboriginal people rather than what Aboriginal people do for Australia. It's worth thinking about that, because when it comes to the extraordinary explosion of artistic creativity across multiple Aboriginal communities, across the length and breadth of this vast continent, this is creating a revolution in international consciousness of who we are as contemporary Australia. A lot of us here at home don't quite realise that. Whenever I travel elsewhere in the world, either as Foreign Minister or as Prime Minister or more recently, it's quite rare that you pass any conversation of any length without some reflection on the depth and the beauty of Indigenous art in this country. It is collected widely across the world, with reverence and with care, and with a keen eye for value. It is one of the great contemporary art happenings. So when we in Australia think about Indigenous Australia, one of the transforming realities is what Indigenous art is doing to the image of Australia as a whole across the world. And I think the wonder of reconciliation is this. Rather than us awkwardly pushing all that to one side, as if it's a little embarrassing to talk about, which in decades past from time to time it was, for many, it is now fully embraced by all in this country, or practically all. And it is doing us a power of good across the world. So to Indigenous artists in Australia today, I would simply say this: thank you for what you are doing for Australia. There are one or two other reflections in the earlier volume which caused me to think again as well. And it goes to the nature of Aboriginal art and how it has prospered in these recent times, times which have also seen continued difficulty for Indigenous communities. Now again, I quote this from the first volume. Art for Aboriginal people has always been a tool for survival. As Far North Queensland artist and mother Samantha Hobson explains, it was doing art with the Lockhart River Art Gang that motivated her to pull herself out of a cycle of self-destruction. When mothers thrive, the children survive, she said. Similarly, Lockhart artist Fiona Erminio said that what stimulated her to paint is righting wrongs. It continues, and this is a remarkable figure. How then does one, given that at least 50% of Australian artists are Indigenous, and that they come from less than 4% of Australia's population, the power of art as a potent weapon of survival is telling. As Oscar Wilde noted, the most successful art comes not from ambition, but from necessity. The most successful art comes not from ambition, but from the necessity, I would say, of the soul. This, I think, is a profound insight also as to how our Indigenous brothers and sisters have come to paint in the most adverse and difficult of circumstances. One final reflection from the earlier volume is this, and it goes to where this contemporary Aboriginal art movement fits in the spectrum of Australian art and more broadly in the art of the world. Here again, I think, is a profound observation. Contemporary Aboriginal art also accounts for why it in itself is no longer viewed as tribal or ethnographic, and instead graces the white walls of the contemporary galleries around the world. It is the cultural power embedded in the modernist character of the work that causes Time magazine art critic, now the late and much lamented Robert Hughes, to proclaim, and this is what Hughes himself said, and I quote him, "The Aboriginal art movement is the last great art movement of the 20th century," unquote. Again, I emphasise that for one simple reason. Here in this country, occasionally we need to remind ourselves what we are privileged to be part of. Not just in the spectrum of the great art movements of this country from Heidelberg to the present, but also across the great art movements of the world from the post-war period. This brings us to the present volume, an extraordinary tome in itself, and I'm sure all 104 volumes will be sold before we conclude today. That is what Pat has instructed me to ensure. In case you haven't seen it, this is it. 2.5 kilos, it'll nestle gently in your handbag as you go. This volume, not entitled New Beginnings, because the beginnings are now some decades gone, it is entitled Power and Colour. It is a powerful volume. I listened carefully to what was said before about the treatment of power in the contemporary art of our Indigenous brothers and sisters. Just before, we were told, quoting another great, that aesthetics is the prior state to ethics. This, again, is an extraordinary insight. What are our Indigenous brothers and sisters saying when they paint beautiful paintings of the types which are displayed in this most recent volume and are part of Pat's collection? They strike you in the eye, and they belong to a long and ancient tradition in the Western art world as well. Think, for example, of Goya's paintings of the Napoleonic occupation of Spain at the beginning of the 19th century. The extraordinary savagery and brutality of those paintings, which simply speak to the human soul and saying, how could this happen? The savagery of the butchery of a child, for example. We think of Guernica's painting, Picasso's painting on Guernica, the German strafing of the town in northern Spain in the war, in the Spanish Civil War in the lead up to the Second World War. We think of pre-Raphaelites and part of the collection here in the Art Gallery of Queensland, including extraordinary paintings like that entitled Evicted. These are all essays on power. These are all visual essays on power, its use and its abuse. And this tradition is alive and well with those of us who have eyes to see in the contemporary art of the Indigenous world as well. And could I say, therefore, this has been beautifully recorded in the introduction to the most recent volume. And then we go to its second theme, the riot of colour itself. There is a riot of colour in contemporary Indigenous art. It is an art movement unfolding, growing, shaping and reshaping itself. And you see right across northern Australia and in far north Queensland new experiments in colour which are not traditionally associated with the deep browns and ochres of what we've seen in previous generations of Indigenous art. This is adding a new power in itself to the aesthetic and the ethics of contemporary Indigenous art. The other great thing to emerge from this volume is, of course, the stories that we've become familiar with Emily, but more broadly now across the Indigenous women of Australia as well. Women who for the first time pick up the brush in their 60s and 70s and begin to paint. These are extraordinary stories in themselves, quite apart from what is then produced on the canvas. It is truly remarkable. And for those of us engaged in the rigours of political life, it gives us encouragement that other vocations may beckon at one stage, even those of us sorely challenged when it comes to anything which approaches aesthetic beauty. That's politics, by the way. So Pat, you're an extraordinary bloke. A fellow from Sydney, we forgive him for that because his partial domicile is down in the People's Republic of the Gold Coast. You've always been part and parcel of our life circle through our mutual friends, the Coffees, who are here with us today. Your passion for the aesthetic is known to now thousands of Australians. In the introduction to this volume, it poses the great and deep existential question as to why, Pat, do you do all this? To which the answer is, I just like it. I love it. And that's it. The analogy is driven with his passion also for jazz. Unless you get the foot tapping, then it ain't jazz. And unless paintings of whichever hue, whichever colour, whichever tradition evokes, I think the introduction says, a physiological and a spiritual response in the person observing it, then it's not the sort of painting that Pat would buy or support. But what he does through his work is quite remarkable. He buys paintings. He therefore becomes a patron of the arts. A lot of folk have had their very first paintings bought by this bloke when they were not known by anybody, and suddenly they were known by many. It provides bread on the table. It provides the basic encouragement of those with the creative gift to get on with the business of continuing to create. And therefore, he is a great benefactor of the arts and of artists themselves. The gifts that he has made to collections around the country are now staggering in their proportions. So mate, we just regard you as a very good bloke for what you've done. And leaving aside where the contemporary art movement fits in the great annals of art history, where it fits within the long and unfolding story of struggle on the part of Indigenous Australia, mate, you're just a very decent bloke. And we acknowledge you for that. So folks, this is a good day. This is a good gallery in which to do this. This is a good book about some very good paintings brought to us by a very good Australian man, Pat Corrigan. It gives me great pleasure to launch this volume.